Our next speaker is Leah Kasper from London. She is representing Global Partner Digital with a high social sense, promoting digital environment promoted by human rights and democratic values. They say that internet and digital environment has provided new expression ways, but also has facilitated new repression lines and has intensified inequalities. Since 2012, she has led projects on the intertwining between human rights and internet. Now she's working in the implementation of the program on cyber capacities, GPD, so to implement processes of cyber policies, focusing on more inclusive policies, everything we are addressing today, really. So Leah, when you have the floor, she will address you in English. I was talking to her before, and she speaks very good Spanish, but I'm sure that she will express herself much better in English. Thank you so much, Leah, for being here. And the floor is yours. An applause for her. Thank you.
Hola. Antes de empezar,
Before starting, apologies, because I'm going to address you in English. You can make use of the simultaneous interpreting.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Allow me first and foremost to thank you for this opportunity and for organizing the first International Gender and Cybersecurity Forum. This is an important and urgent topic, and it is my honor and privilege to address this gathering on behalf of Global Partners Digital. This morning, I would like to talk to you about the importance of inclusiveness in cyber policy making. In my presentation, I will first outline the nature of the challenge in enabling a free, open, and secure cyberspace. I will then follow this with an argument about how greater inclusiveness in cyber policy making is a key tool to help us address the challenge. And we will then look at what an inclusive policy making process could look like in practice, and some of its key characteristics. And finally, I will end with a couple of takeaway points. Throughout the presentation, I will draw on examples that highlight the implications of these phenomena for gender equality. Let us start with stating the obvious. Governing cyberspace is the key policy challenge of our times. Figuring out how we harness its potential while mitigating the risks is the $1 million question of our generation. On the one hand, ICTs and the internet have brought about unprecedented opportunities for economic and social development for people around the world, and they can be a game changer for women and girls. For instance, through mobile health apps that help bridge the gap between access to health information and service provision. Or in India, where women are crowdsourcing information about reliable reproductive and sexual health practitioners among themselves. And examples like this abound in countries around the world. At the same time, we need to be aware that over half of the world's population is still not connected to the internet. New digital divides are emerging, not only between countries, but also within them. And as we've heard this morning, the gender gap in internet usage between men and women is staggering. In addition, for those of us who do get online, the digital environment has opened us up to new risks. High-profile cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, the spread of hate speech and fake news, online violent extremism, just to mention a few examples. And many of these risks disproportionately affect women and girls. One recent study found that 76% of women surveyed had experienced some form of abuse or harassment online. Now, while online violence against women is an expression of the gender discrimination and inequality that we also find offline, it often becomes amplified in the online space. Now, the importance of finding solutions to address these issues that will enable a digital environment that is secure, that is open, and that is where our rights can be enjoyed and respected cannot be overstated. And as the use of ICTs and the internet becomes all but ubiquitous, the task becomes ever more urgent. Okay, so the challenge in front of us is pretty huge, so what can we do about it? And this is where inclusiveness comes in. and inclusiveness in policymaking in particular. In 2016, there was a World Bank report on digital dividends, which highlighted the importance of good governance as a key analog complement necessary to fully reap the benefits of the digital revolution. And at Global Partners Digital, the organization that I run, we agree with this. In over a decade of engaging on digital policy and digital rights issues, we have come to believe that the vision of a free, open, and secure cyberspace can only be achieved through policy making that is open, inclusive, and transparent. And the reason for this is not just intrinsic value of inclusiveness, which you may or may not agree with. The actually most compelling argument for inclusive policymaking is simple. It leads to better policy outcomes. It leads to policy outcomes that bring us closer to a cyberspace that is open, free, and secure. And we can look at a couple of examples of how inclusive policymaking can do that. I'll give an example of a process that I've participated in. In 2014, we were in Busan, South Korea, and the ITU, which is an International Telecommunications Union, was holding its plenipotentiary conference. And one of the items on the agenda was measures to combat counterfeit devices. Now, this is a big issue in developing countries, especially in some of the countries in Africa. And the proposal on the table was suggesting the countries, signatories of this resolution that was going to be passed, should take all necessary measures to combat counterfeit. Now, the consensus of the delegates in that room was clear. We need to do whatever it takes to combat counterfeit. And the problem there, I mean, it sounds reasonable, right? You want to, counterfeit devices have security problems and raise a number of issues, including some health issues that have been raised. What the problem is, and what decision makers in that room were not thinking about, is the fact that in a number of developing countries, a huge percentage of users relies particularly on counterfeit devices to share information, to communicate, to socialize. So taking all or any necessary measure indiscriminately to combat counterfeit would, in effect, disproportionately affect these people's human rights, their freedom of expression. And in this particular case, what happened was that because a couple of delegations in that room opened their representation or opened their delegations to multi-stakeholder participation, which means they had representatives not just from government, but also from civil society and private sector in the room, we were able to make the point that in any effort to combat counterfeit, you need to take into account user connectivity. And we managed to get that language into the resolution. So that's one example of how more inclusive policymaking can lead to better outcomes. And another example, which I'd like to make, is perhaps to demonstrate what happens when key stakeholders, or what could happen when key stakeholders are absent. So recently I was in a conference where one of the keynote speakers talked about smart cities. And this is a big topic at the moment in cyber policy. And the thing that the speaker was most excited about was the potential of ubiquitous connectivity in smart cities and what that would mean for law enforcement. And he was making a point how great, you know, like if we have all this information at our fingertips, law enforcement agencies can make better decisions about and solve crime. Now, someone in the audience raised a question about what the implications for privacy are of such measures. And what's important to note that is that, and what actually the speaker said, that, well, you know, this needs to, the balance between these things, between privacy and security, between rights and freedoms and security, need to be balanced according to a social contract of the community that is affected. And I mean, that sounds sensible, right? The issue is, how can we expect that that social contract represents us and respects our rights if the only people in the room who are deciding it are security agencies? And this is not to say that security agencies don't have legitimate interest and that are valuable for societies. The issue is that if it's disproportionately balanced towards just one stakeholder group, it's unlikely that the policy outcome would be satisfactory. So I think that there are more examples and scenarios, and I know that I don't want to go into more, but if you're interested in this, it's especially good to look at and to think about how inclusive policymaking is important in addressing issues where technical expertise is necessary. But say these examples have convinced you more or less, or you've already been convinced that inclusive policymaking is a good thing. And many decision makers that we work with are convinced of this. And in fact, the need to have inclusive policymaking processes has been recognized and increasingly is getting recognized in numerous cybersecurity fora and statements, including in the chair's statement of the Global Conference of Cyberspace, which was held in The Hague in 2015. However, what they struggle with is implementation. And in an effort to address this, we at GPD have developed a tool, a framework for inclusive cyber policy making, which sets a standard for what it means for a process to be inclusive, and which provides a way to measure existing processes to determine how inclusive they already are. And there are 6 characteristics which I'll briefly outline. Don't worry, it's not going to take long. The first one is whether or not the process is open and accessible, which would mean whether it's open to all stakeholders and to people from different backgrounds, diverse backgrounds and abilities. Second, whether the process is diverse, and does it include a range of views and interests, and whether consideration is given to a different range of inputs and contributions. 3, is the process collaborative? Do we share a joint commitment as participants in a process? Or is there a level of trust that we're going towards the same goal? 4th, is it evidence-based? Now this is important, and when we're talking about gender and inclusiveness, we've heard this morning, I'm sure we heard you throughout this event, we'll hear throughout this event that data about gender inequality is often sparse. So getting good data is key to making appropriate decisions about policies that are, well, making appropriate policies. And last but not least, the 6th characteristic in our view of an inclusive policy-making process would be whether it's transparent and accountable, which means whether there are procedures and mechanisms that are reliable, and whether there are a system for records and disclosure, and whether there are clean lines of accountability. Now, no one size fits all, and we need to consider and be aware of the specific policy issue, the specific stage in a policy process, local context, legacy structures. We're not saying that you would have the same approach if you're engaging in a legislative process or if you're developing a cyber policy, national cybersecurity strategy, for instance. So these would need to be taken into account. And on top of this, structural conditions that we just talked about need to go hand in hand with those related to agency. And investment in skills and knowledge of different stakeholders need to accompany structural measures to make a process truly inclusive. Okay, so we've talked about the challenge in front of us, about how greater inclusiveness in cyber policy making can help address it, and what some of its characteristics might look like in practice. What would I want you to take away from this? Well, as cyber practitioners and users of ICTs, as we return to our daily efforts to make cyberspace more open, free, and secure, be it through developing policies, being through working on draft cybercrime laws, bills, or working on addressing hate speech online, there are 2 things that I'd like you to go away with, and one is process matters. If you're working on any of these policies related to cyber, I would encourage you to reflect on the characteristics that I mentioned. Ask yourself whether the process that you are developing or engaging in is open, is diverse, is transparent. And secondly, as they say in the UK, really the proof is in the pudding. I don't know if that translates into Spanish, but basically that means that the proof is in the outcome. And the ultimate test of whether or not we're doing a good job is really the quality of the policy outcomes that we produce. So ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, inclusive policy-making processes are in no way guarantors of gender diversity or equality, yeah? But they are an important element in a suite of tools that we need to use in order to deal with this challenge. Ultimately, they'll get us one step closer to a free, open, and secure cyberspace. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your kind attention. Muchas gracias por su atención. Sí.